wanted to ask you, first off, do you have a Tower record store? Did you have one that you went to when you were growing up? And how did you get to know Russ? Because I'm just fascinated. What drew you to tell this story?
I'll take yours. First off, I want to thank you all for coming out. This was an absolute treat. We've screened this movie in many different places, many film festivals. You were hands down the best audience we've played for. Power bags. So I grew up in Sacramento. I was born and raised there. My parents split up when I was pretty young. And I stayed in Sacramento, and it's where I bought my music. I didn't have a sweet tooth. I bought CDs and cassettes. That was really sort of where my formative years were spent, in record stores. And it was a point of civic pride knowing that Tower was such a big company, and it was from my hometown. Because at least at the time I didn't really realize if there was anything else from Sacramento. But then, funny enough, I had also sort of put together later that my godmother worked at Tower Records, and some of her friends worked in San Francisco in the 70s at some of the stores. So I remember hearing stories about Russ. But I didn't really know much about him. And then when the stores were closing, I sort of discovered the history of the company and the connection with the old drugstore. And I thought that was such an engaging story that I sort of gathered a core group of guys that were also from Sacramento that had also moved to Los Angeles around the same time I had. And I said, hey, I want to do this documentary, but we got to find a way to approach Russ Solomon. And one of my producing partners, Tim, says, I think we have the same dentist. And so we had the dentist reach out to Russ Solomon. It's a very Sacramento way of that's how that happened. Yeah.
All right, you can keep the mic. So this is a documentary about a record store, so I feel like we got to talk about the music, the score. I really enjoyed it because it had such a diverse types of songs. So can you talk about the selection process?
Oh, I'm very glad that you noticed that. Yeah, well, that was a very big thing for me. In fact, when I was interviewing Darren Roberts, who edited the film, one of the first things I asked him was, all right, so what kind of music do you listen to? Because if you're going to be putting in a bunch of bad music, I don't want it. So the sort of rule that I gave him was quite simple. I said, I want a soundtrack that is not the most obvious. And so when we're in San Francisco, the Summer of Love, if I hear Jefferson Airplane, I'm going to tell you you're doing something wrong. I don't want to hear Purple Haze. I don't want to hear all those songs that you already know that identify an era that have already been played out. What I want is something that helps tell in a chronological order, the history of recorded music, so to speak. I mean, obviously not starting at the beginning, but I would like it to be time correct, time specific. But I want a variety. I want every song to represent a different aisle in a Tower Records. And I thought that that was really incredibly important. I was so adamant about this that when we were doing our mix, I fought incredibly hard to get a song from a movie soundtrack in our movie. I wanted to get a score from, I think it was Ocean's 13, because I kept saying, we don't have soundtracks. We need soundtracks represented in the music. But eventually someone said, no, you don't want to pay that much money for that. That's okay. Yeah.
So, I'm curious, Colin, how did you approach having all the different kinds of footage that you do as a director? Because you interviewed some legends and icons in this, Elton John, Bruce Springsteen, and then you had such access to Russ, and in addition to all the archival footage that you found. That's such a wealth of material. How did you begin that process of paring it down and finding the story that you wanted to tell?
Well, it wasn't really so much about, we had 7 years making the film, so it took a long time, and really you sort of start small, and we sort of built it piece by piece. And it wasn't until we had sort of amassed enough that then we were able to really start digitizing B-roll and things like that. And so the interviews were sort of done, very small at first. Our first interview was with Russ in the old Watt Avenue store. That was one of the first interviews we did. I think we did 2 others on that trip, and then there was a few years there that were really lean, where we didn't have any money. We were trying to get more funding. We did a Kickstarter. That helped. The technologies and cameras helped, so all of a sudden you didn't need to rent one red camera, but you could, red being the brand, not the color of the camera. But then, you could you could shoot a film with 2 or 3, Canon 5Ds, which you could buy at a store for a relatively low cost. So the technology then became a little bit more doable. So we were able to then sort of piece together, do a road trip up to Sacramento, shoot a little bit more. And then as things progressed and we were able to get more and more of the film sort of together, we were then able to make one last push for financing. And once we had that, then we were able to get all of the, sort of celebrity interviews. We were able to lock down, having enough money to go to Japan for the ending of the film. So it was all a little bit, and I'll be quite honest, this is where Russ really sort of changed my life completely, because as I discovered, as getting to know him, interviewing him for the film, but also spending a lot of time hanging out with him, drinking with him, lovely wife Patty, I realized they didn't know what they were doing either. And they were just trying to figure it out, and they were just putting together whatever they could and going on a hunch. And so I just said, well, I'm just going to sort of pull a page from that playbook, and I'll see how far it gets me. And luckily, thankfully, it got me to finishing the movie, thank goodness. And I was been able to direct a couple of other documentaries since then. So
I have a follow-up to Sean's question.
Mm-hmm.
You did get to interview a lot of music legends.
Mm-hmm.
Did you geek out on any of them? Were there any that, no?
Yeah, I mean, I was, look, I'll be honest, a few of those people I actually had known for a while, so I'm not ever the coolest person in the room when Bruce is there, because Bruce is the coolest person in the room. But I will say that there were some people that I interviewed for the film that unfortunately we weren't able to include, which is really unfortunate, because I was really excited about getting the chance to speak with them and talk with them. We spoke with Questlove from The Roots, who was fantastic, and he was just a wealth of knowledge. But unfortunately, the angle that I was playing at to put him in the film, we ended up not really having time to use. Chuck D from Public Enemy was another one, and Chris Cornell was another one that I really wanted to get in. Really, it was just sort of pulling favors. The best one is Grohl, because I knew that he had worked there, and we had exchanged stories through friends, and oh, I used to work at Tower Records. Colin Hanks is doing a documentary about Tower Records. Yeah, I know, I'm going to do it at some point. And then finally I run into him at I had planned it. I was going to interview a bunch of people during the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony, what is in LA, and I was waiting to find Dave, and I knew if I ran into him, I could get him. And so he was watching some band perform. I said, "Hey man, you want to do that interview?" He goes, "Sure, man." And the next thing you know, an hour later, his manager's going, "Yeah, you needed to run that by me, but congratulations and good luck with your little film." We've since become very good friends, so it's fine. It's not a problem.
Okay, so we're going to open up to the audience. Do you guys have any questions? Don't be shy. Oh, you're not shy.
Yeah. I'm just curious about, there's so much emotion, which I can certainly see from the employees who have such an affection for us. But when you interview someone like Jim Urey, who got so emotional and cried on camera, were you surprised by that reaction?
Oh, completely shocked. This is actually true. When we started the film, I was doing all of the interviews. but we didn't have enough money for me to be able to review all of the footage. And so about 4 years later, we ended up bringing on a very talented guy by the name of Stephen Leckhart, who is the writer. And I told him, I said, look, I'm having a really hard time trying to make sure that people are comfortable for the interview, do all the lighting things that I need to do, talk with the DP, do all these things, and then remember the, all of the questions and the areas that I need to cover, because I haven't seen any of the footage yet. There was footage in this film that I had shot 5 years prior that I had never seen until we got an editor with a final little bit of financing. And so Stephen, it got to the point when Stephen came on, I said, I need you to do the interviews. And I would sit behind Stephen, and it gave me this luxury of being just one step removed, because Stephen could talk with everybody and get them comfortable while they were getting their makeup done. Because it's a very nerve-wracking thing. And it gave me just a little bit of breathing room, so I could actually really hear their answers and go, okay, this is where I want to explore. And so Stephen and I would sort of have like a route of where we were going to go, and I had these little post-it notes, and whenever there was something interesting, I'd slip him the post-it note. Sort of do the old, like, sort of 60 Minutes TV producer type thing with him. And it was incredibly helpful. For Jim's interview, I would always try and be out of their eyesight, because I didn't want it to be distracting. And I would always have my head down, I had my earphones on, and I'm writing, and I just all of a sudden I notice this pause, and I look up, and all of a sudden Jim's crying. That was obviously a moment where there's part of me, and this is rude, but there's part of me as a film director that goes, yes! Great! Fantastic! I've got some real emotion here, and something that is really conveying an important theme for us. But then there's also a part of me that is just like, well, the instinct is to just turn these cameras off and let them collect themselves, and I totally understand what moments like that are. But Jim, he was so gracious and so kind and was so adamant that we keep that in the film because it was important. It was important that people understand the kind of person that Russ was, to Jim. So those kinds of moments, you never expect them. You always secretly kind of want them. And then when they happen, you instantly feel a little bit guilty, but you're also kind of relieved.
I'm going to take one more question. I saw your hand first. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You may have already hinted at this answer, but the way you were describing putting the movie together in pieces over a span of time kind of reminds me of Doug Liman, the way he directs movies. But I was curious, how much of what you were filming was actually usable once you kind of figured out what it was? Like, did you find yourself sacrificing stuff at first and kind of figure out how to not have it happen that much?
Well, it's hard when you're trying to cover a story that actually kind of takes place over 50 years. And there's so many different aspects to the story that I think are really interesting and sort of worth discussing, but unfortunately you don't have the time. When we were having a hard time securing financing, one of the things I thought was always so reassuring was when people found out that I was making a documentary about Tower Records. They'd look at my little Tower Records pin, and they'd instantly tell me these amazing stories about experiences they had. Some of them very funny, some of them incredibly R-rated, some of them X-rated, every kind of rated you could possibly imagine, with the exception of PG. But they were all these really fantastic, fun sort of stories, and we really wanted to sort of tell those stories. Unfortunately, what we realized is just taking the time to tell those stories, that doesn't push a narrative. It's an amazing anecdote, and it's a lot of fun. But it doesn't actually help push your story forward. It's just a nice little detour. You can have a few of those, but you can't have a movie filled with them. And that was a really hard lesson for me to learn, because there was a lot of those really great, fun stories that I wanted to include. You want to include the story about bringing a painted elephant into the room and getting it drunk on champagne, which happened. But at the same time you go, well, maybe, that will just be a really amazing selection you know, the extras on the DVDs. So you end up just finessing it and fine tuning it. You know, I think the biggest lesson that I learned on it, and then we can wrap up. It's been 2 years since I've done one of these, so I'm just happy that anyone cares. The thing that was the best lesson for me as a filmmaker was I went in with the gut instinct of, oh, I'm going to tell a retrospective about this company, and here are all the amazing things that this company did. And that's interesting to a point, but it's not going to be interesting to everybody. The only thing that can be interesting to everyone is someone that can tell a story and someone that can make you laugh. And I lucked out in finding Russ Solomon. And I lucked out in the fact that Russ said, oh, and here are all these other people that you got to talk to. And I lucked out when I turned to Patty and said, Patty, I can't have an entire film of old men talking. That's lame. Do you know of any women? And they go, yep, I got Heidi Kotler. She's a firecracker. She'll be great. And she was. So when you end up, or when you're able to find a story that has those kinds of characters in it, those kinds of characters that even just listening to them talk, you feel like you kind of know them, that was the best lesson that I could have gotten. Not only as, you know, as someone that's you know, that makes documentary films, but also as an actor. You know, you want to be able to feel that connection, you know, with somebody. And so that to me was the thing that sort of like sprouted out of those long droughts of, you know, not making the movie, not knowing what it was going to be, sort of trying to wrap my head around all these dates and times and places and all that sort of stuff. Never mind all of the business aspect of you know, the music industry and how deep into that do we want to get? Like, do we really want to get into the definition of rack jobbing? Or can we just lean on the fact that that sounds really cool? Those kinds of things. So I don't know if that answers your question. All right.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you very much.